In this episode, we move from choosing a risk treatment option to doing the harder and more practical work of putting that choice into motion in a way the business can actually carry out and later explain. That shift matters because many organizations are capable of discussing risk intelligently in meetings, but far fewer are consistently good at turning those conversations into action that is clear, owned, monitored, and preserved in the record. The Certified in Risk and Information Systems Control (C-RISC) mindset expects more than a good analysis and a sensible recommendation. It expects the organization to make a response decision, implement that decision in a disciplined way, and document it well enough that leaders, auditors, regulators, business owners, and future team members can all understand what was decided, why it was decided, and what exposure still remains. Once you see that clearly, this topic becomes much more than paperwork. It becomes the part of risk management where judgment is translated into accountable action, and that is where strong programs begin to separate themselves from organizations that only talk about risk without truly managing it. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful place to begin is with the difference between deciding on a response and implementing a response, because those two activities are closely related but definitely not the same thing. A response decision is the formal choice about how the organization will handle a risk, such as accepting it, reducing it, shifting part of the burden, or stepping away from the activity creating the exposure. Implementation is what happens after that decision, when people have to convert broad intent into real work, real ownership, real timelines, and real evidence that the organization is doing what it said it would do. This matters because many weak programs fail in the gap between the meeting and the follow-through. Leadership may approve a mitigation. A business owner may verbally accept a risk, or a team may agree that a vendor issue should be escalated. But if nobody translates that choice into actions, responsibilities, deadlines, decision records, and progress tracking, the organization is left with a response that exists in theory but not in practice. Good implementation closes that gap and gives the business a way to prove that the decision became something more than a sentence in a discussion. Before implementation begins, the organization needs a response decision that is clear enough to be acted upon. And this sounds simple until you see how often decisions are expressed in vague language. If a team says it will improve controls, monitor the issue, or revisit the matter later, those phrases may sound reassuring, but they do not tell anyone what will actually happen, who will do it, what success looks like, or how the remaining exposure will be judged in the meantime. A response decision becomes implementation ready only when it is specific enough to guide action. That usually means the business can describe what treatment has been chosen, what risk or scenario the decision applies to, what the intended outcome is, how much reduction or stability is expected, and what residual risk the organization is prepared to carry while the work is in progress. This level of clarity matters because ambiguity creates delay, and delay quietly becomes unmanaged exposure. When a decision is defined well at the start, implementation becomes far easier because teams are not forced to guess what leaders meant after the fact or invent their own version of the response. Ownership becomes especially important at this stage because implementation work almost always crosses more than one role, and confusion about authority is one of the fastest ways for progress to stall. The risk owner is the person accountable for deciding how the business will handle the exposure and whether the remaining level of risk is acceptable. The control owner may be the person responsible for operating or improving a safeguard that supports the chosen treatment. Operational managers, project leaders, legal advisors, procurement staff, and technical specialists may all have responsibilities tied to the implementation as well, but responsibility for completing tasks is not the same as authority to decide whether the business is satisfied with the result. That distinction matters because teams often assume the people doing the work are also the people who can approve the final position, and that is not always true. Strong implementation therefore begins by clarifying who owns the risk decision, who owns the treatment activities, who must provide evidence or sign off, and who needs to be informed if the work slips, changes, or fails to reduce the exposure as expected. Once ownership is clear, the response decision needs to be translated into an actionable plan, because implementation succeeds through structured work rather than through general good intentions. If the organization has chosen mitigation, the plan should explain which controls, process changes, or resilience improvements will be introduced, and in what order. If the organization has chosen temporary acceptance while a broader change is underway, the plan should explain how the exposure will be monitored, when the decision will be reviewed again, and what conditions would trigger escalation before that review date arrives. A solid implementation plan also addresses dependencies, because many response decisions rely on budget approval, vendor cooperation, testing windows, staffing availability, business process changes, or other projects already in motion. This is why risk response implementation often feels closer to program management than to one-time security work. It requires sequencing, milestones, progress visibility, and awareness of the fact that treatment can fail even when everyone agrees it is needed if nobody has built a realistic path from approval to completion. Acceptance decisions are a particularly good example of why implementation matters, because people often treat acceptance as though it requires no action at all. In reality, a well-implemented acceptance decision is one of the most disciplined forms of response because it requires the organization to acknowledge that some residual exposure will remain and then manage that fact openly rather than pretending the issue disappeared. A proper acceptance decision should identify who approved the risk, why acceptance was chosen, what assumptions support that choice, what current controls are already in place, and how long the business intends to carry that position before reviewing it again. It should also describe what changes would make the accepted risk no longer acceptable, such as increased transaction volume, new legal obligations, repeated control failures, or a business dependency becoming more critical over time. When acceptance is implemented this way, it becomes a visible and governed business decision. When it is not implemented this way, acceptance often becomes nothing more than quiet inaction, and quiet inaction is not the same thing as responsible risk management. Mitigation decisions are often easier for learners to picture because they look like obvious action, but even here the real challenge is not simply deciding to reduce the risk. The challenge is implementing that reduction in a way that is effective, testable, and aligned with the business conditions that created the concern in the first place. A mitigation may involve new technical controls, stronger review processes, better logging, more disciplined change approval, revised training, tighter vendor oversight, or redesigned recovery procedures. Still, none of those measures should be treated as complete simply because a task was started or a tool was purchased. Implementation requires the organization to confirm that the chosen safeguard was deployed where it actually matters, that people understand their roles in operating it, that exceptions are handled in a controlled way, and that the new measure meaningfully changes the likelihood or impact of the original risk. This is why mitigation should never be documented as complete on the basis of activity alone. What matters is whether the activity changed the exposure in the way leadership expected when the decision was originally approved. Transfer decisions require equally careful implementation, because shifting part of the financial or operational burden to another party is only useful when the organization understands exactly what has been shifted and what still remains inside its own accountability boundary. If a business relies on insurance, the response cannot end with buying a policy and assuming the problem is solved. Someone must understand coverage limits, exclusions, notification obligations, timing requirements, and the kinds of losses the policy will and will not absorb. If the organization is transferring exposure through a vendor contract or outsourcing arrangement, implementation means confirming that the contract language is clear, that security and performance obligations are meaningful, that evidence can be requested when needed, and that escalation rights exist if the vendor fails to meet expectations. This is one reason transfer is often misunderstood by beginners. The organization may shift some cost or assign some operational duties elsewhere, but if it does not implement that transfer through disciplined contract management, oversight, and record keeping, then the decision is weak and the business may discover too late that most of the pain still returns to its own doorstep. Avoidance decisions also need careful implementation because changing or stopping an activity sounds simple until you look at the surrounding business reality. If a company decides to retire a vulnerable service, stop collecting a certain type of sensitive data, discontinue a risky process, or exit a third-party arrangement that creates too much uncertainty, that choice can affect revenue, customer experience, staffing, workflows, procurement obligations, and strategic plans. Implementation, therefore, means more than saying the organization will stop. It means planning how the activity will be changed, what dependencies must be unwound, how customers or internal stakeholders will be affected, and what new risks may appear as a side effect of the change. In some cases, the organization is not avoiding all exposure, but only a particularly risky part of an activity, which makes implementation even more dependent on clarity. A strong avoidance decision is carried out through controlled change, communication, and verification. A weak one is announced broadly and then eroded later by exceptions, workarounds, or business pressure that quietly reintroduces the same exposure under a different name. Documentation sits at the center of all of this because every response decision needs a reliable record that explains what was decided, who approved it, what evidence supported the decision, what treatment activities are attached to it, and what residual exposure the organization still expects to carry. Good documentation is not a bureaucratic add-on. It is what allows the organization to preserve judgment over time. People change roles, memory becomes selective, projects get renamed, priorities shift, and 6 months later the business still needs to know whether a risk was accepted, mitigated, transferred, or avoided, whether the implementation was completed, and whether the current position is still aligned with business expectations. A strong record, therefore, includes the risk description, the business rationale for the chosen response, the names or roles of the approving parties, the implementation timeline if applicable, and the review or expiration point if the decision is temporary. Without this level of detail, the organization may still believe it is managing risk, but it loses the ability to prove that management was disciplined, informed, and anchored to real accountability. The quality of documentation matters just as much as its existence, because vague or overly technical records can weaken governance almost as much as missing records do. If the decision record says monitoring will continue, leadership approved the change, or the issue is being addressed, those phrases leave too much to interpretation. A better record states what will be monitored, by whom, using what information, and what threshold would trigger renewed attention or escalation. It explains what exactly leadership approved, what conditions shaped that approval, and whether the treatment is expected to reduce likelihood, reduce impact, or simply support temporary stability while a broader effort unfolds. Good documentation also uses business language rather than relying entirely on technical shorthand, because the purpose of the record is not only to satisfy the originating team. It is to support later review by governance groups, internal audit, business leaders, regulators, or future managers who need to understand the decision without reconstructing it from fragments. Clarity, context, and traceability are therefore essential qualities of useful response documentation. Implementation also requires monitoring, because a response decision should not disappear into a file or a project tracker once it has been approved. The organization needs a way to see whether the treatment is progressing, whether promised milestones are being met, whether interim controls remain in place, and whether the residual risk is changing while the work is underway. If mitigation stalls, if a vendor fails to meet agreed obligations, if a review date for accepted risk passes without discussion, or if a supposedly avoided activity continues informally through workaround behavior, then the response has not truly been implemented as intended. This is why reporting and follow-up are essential companions to documentation. Progress updates should connect back to the original decision so leadership can tell whether the response is still on track and whether the assumptions behind the approval remain valid. Implementation without follow-through creates a dangerous illusion of control. The organization feels safer because a decision was made, but the actual exposure may remain largely unchanged because the response was never monitored seriously enough to confirm that it worked. Several common mistakes weaken this process, and recognizing them early can improve both exam reasoning and real-world judgment. One mistake is treating approval as completion, as though a signed decision means the exposure has already changed. Another is documenting the chosen option without documenting the rationale. which makes later review much harder when people need to understand why the business took that path instead of another one. Some organizations assign treatment tasks, but never make clear who owns the ultimate risk decision, which leads to stalled action and quiet disagreement about whether the result is good enough. Others fail to set review dates for accepted risk or neglect to capture interim exposure while a mitigation project is underway. A final mistake is writing documentation that satisfies the originating team but cannot support audit, oversight, or executive understanding later. Strong implementation avoids these traps by combining clear ownership, realistic action planning, disciplined records, and sustained visibility into whether the response is actually changing the business position the way it was intended to. By the end of this discussion, the core lesson should be clear that implementing and documenting risk response decisions is where risk management becomes durable, accountable, and reviewable over time. A response option may be sensible on paper, but until it is translated into owned action, realistic milestones, evidence of progress, and clear documentation of what was decided and why, it remains incomplete. Strong implementation means understanding what the chosen treatment requires in practice, whether that treatment is acceptance, mitigation, transfer, or avoidance, and making sure the business can later explain the path it took and the residual exposure it still carries. Strong documentation means capturing not just the decision but the context, the approvals, the assumptions, the timelines, and the review points that make the decision meaningful later. That is why this topic matters so much in Domain 3. It takes risk response out of the world of intentions and places it firmly in the world of accountable business action, which is exactly where mature risk management belongs.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.